Welcome to Arts of Hermes, a show about Hermeticism and the Hermetic arts of magic, alchemy, and astrology, in theory and in practice, from the modern day back to the ancient world. A show interested in esoteric philosophy, occulture, mythology, surrealism, and cosmic consciousness. My name is Matthew Vaughn. I'm a writer and hermeticist, and this is the second video in our series on occulture. So in the first video, I introduced the concept of occulture and introduced some of the broader themes and concepts that we will be working with across this series. It's not necessary that you've seen that to appreciate this video here, but if you'd like to take a look at that, it might help to deepen, some of or make more connections between some of the topics that we'll talk about today and some things we'll talk about in future videos in this series. Same thing will hold true in all the future videos in this series. You definitely don't need to see them in order or have seen all of them, but they are interconnected and will pick up themes and concepts from one video to the next and develop them. So they are intended to work together as a series at the same time. Let's see. So before we get into our main topic for today, first off, and as always, if you like the work that I'm doing here and you'd like to support the show, you can, of course, like, subscribe, share, these videos on social media or do other things that help, new people find the show. If you know people directly that you think would be interested, word of mouth is always a great way to help new people discover the show. Let's see, all the videos that I'm doing are completely freely available. None of them, require a subscription. But, if you like the work that I'm doing here, I would I'd ask you to consider, supporting the work financially, if that's something you're able to do. If not, please just enjoy the videos. It was important to me that they be available to everyone, regardless of means. But if it is something available that you'd be able to do, I appreciate the support on Patreon. You can also buy a copy of my book. As of this recording, I've published one book, the first of a two-part work called Between the Worlds, an attempt to articulate a modern hermetic worldview and to consider the implications of Hermeticism for the modern world and what it has to offer. I think modern people and people grappling with a lot of the issues that we face today in the contemporary world. Let's see. So before we get into our main topic today, the musical group Coil, I just wanted to make a few follow-up remarks on the first video. Just a few things that I think I'd mentioned briefly, but I wanted to add too. So one thing I know I talked about a little bit was the relevance of cultural works and works of art that engage with esoteric themes or concepts or are produced through esoteric processes, and the relevance of those things for esoteric practitioners, for people who are on a hermetic or a Western esoteric path. I think this is something we can continue to reflect on as this series goes on, but just for the moment, I just wanted to mention a few possibilities here. First of all, and as we did mention last time, cultural works or esoteric works of art can be introductions, gateways to deeper study. For those unfamiliar with them, they can function as a kind of first contact with these ideas, and maybe also for the possibility that this is that esoteric. An esoteric path is actually something that's possible within the modern world, and that maybe it has relevance, or that it has a certain kind of power which is expressed through that work of art. So it can certainly be both introductory as well as inspiring and encouraging to practitioners. I think these works can function to introduce and develop images, concepts, ideas from esoteric philosophy and practice, and to not just present them to practitioners, but to elaborate them in an artistic or an emotionally resonant way that may not always be available through a more intellectual source. At I think perhaps the highest level, esoteric works of art can actually have a directly transformative effect of directly transforming the consciousness or the worldviews of those who interact with them, especially repeated interactions in a kind of meditation on their sort of themes. through, especially over the course of years of interaction and study. And then finally, I think also that they can function as a way of simply making esoteric or magical themes and ideas more a part of life. That is often a challenge for practitioners, is bridging the gap between ritual practice and daily life in the contemporary world, and making esoteric works of art as simply a way of living a more magical life, and of bringing those aspects of life into more direct contact and communication. All right, so let's see. There's definitely more that I want to say about that in future videos, but maybe that's enough for right now. And we can simply jump into our topic for today, which is the musical group Coil. So Coil was sometimes referred to as an experimental music group. I don't always like the word experimental. I think it implies people just sort of trying things out. But Coil, I think any good musical project or creator, while they certainly experiment and try things out, it's only things that are that work, that are actually released, and that there is much more consideration and planning and forethought intention than the word experimental sometimes implies. While the word avant-garde, I think, can sometimes imply a kind of high culture that isn't necessarily true of some of the underground works that we're talking about here. But in any case, they were a musical group. A lot of their work is electronic, though they did incorporate acoustic instruments into their works as well. Let's see, so they were an English group. They were formed primarily based in London, though they had moved to a more rural area of England on the western coast in the last few years of their existence. So they were formed in 1983 and then continued on until, more or less until 2004, when one of the two core members, John Balance, died in an accident. But then the other core member, Peter Christopherson, continued to release some things that had been in progress for the next few years after that. So existed for about 20 years, from the mid-'80s into the early 2000s. So, as I just mentioned, Coil had two core and consistent members, John Balance and Peter Christopherson. And we'll talk a little more about them and their history in just a few minutes. But I also just wanted to mention that Coil also included a number of other members at various times. Let's see, there was Stephen Thrower, who was a member in the early days from, I believe, 84 into the early 90s. There was Drew McDowell, who joined in the mid-90s and remained a member until he moved to New York, I think in around 99 or 2000. The Welsh musician Paul Sandra, who joined in the late 90s and remained with Coil until 2004. Also Ossian Brown, also known as Simon Norris, who similarly joined, I believe, in the late 90s and remained on until the end. And then a few other musicians listed here who played with Coil on various recordings, and then especially some of these who toured with Coil in their later live period in the last sort of 5 years of their existence. William Breeze on viola, Tom Edwards on the marimba, Mike York on bagpipes, Cliff Stapleton on the hurdy-gurdy. And then in their live shows, they had two dancers known as Black Sun Productions. That was Massimo and Pierce. All right, so just briefly, let's see, I'd like to talk about the biographies of the two core members. The focus in this video is definitely not going to be on their personal biographies or histories, or even the history of the band itself, but rather trying to follow some of the esoteric themes and resonances in Coil's work, and really trying to highlight the really, really central importance of magic and Western esotericism for Coil's entire project and all of their output. All right, so Peter Christopherson was born in 1955 and died in 2010. So he was, I think, probably most known as a member of Throbbing Gristle, who we'll talk about in just a moment, that he was a group he was a member of prior to Coil. He was also he began as a designer working for the design group Hypnosis in the 1970s, who did a lot of album art for people like Pink Floyd and Peter Gabriel, Paul McCartney, and a number of others. So he worked as a photographer and designer by day. Later in the 1980s and into the 90s, he also directed music videos. I think he did some directing for commercials and things like that as well. He directed music videos for Nine Inch Nails, a number of other sort of contemporary groups as well, and was quite successful there. And that work, really helped to fund Coil and their output. Let's see. So I'd like to talk a little bit as we go through in some of these videos about. Or just to look at some of the people that we'll be talking about and their astrological charts, their birth charts. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I know that we have a lot of material to get through here today. But just, for those interested in astrology, here is Peter Christopherson's birth chart. We don't know his birth time, so we don't know exactly where his ascendant is. But just a few of the things that really stand out here. We see some strong Jupiter and Saturn themes. So let's see, the sun is in Pisces, a sign ruled by Jupiter. We also see Jupiter, so Jupiter itself, we see exalted in Cancer. Jupiter's there at 20 degrees Cancer, fairly close to Uranus. We also see Saturn, both Venus, we have Venus in Capricorn, as well as Mercury in Aquarius, both ruled by Saturn, and that's Saturn in Scorpio. And I think that Saturn and Scorpio placement really resonates with some of the darker themes, the interest in, what might be called sort of perversion or fetishistic sexualities that Christopherson was really interested in exploring both in his personal life and in his work. And that we also see that Venus is both directly opposite to Jupiter in that exalted Jupiter in Cancer, so certainly giving a lot of sort of benefit to Venus and sort of success and importance to the artistic production associated with Venus. Now, whereas Venus in Capricorn, I think also speaks to his very kind of minimalist, sort of controlled, geometric, kind of clean sort of design style that we certainly see in Coil's album artwork and other visual output. There is both the darker sort of Saturnian themes there for sure, and also the more taboo, radical, experimental sort of material that we associate with Uranus, which is closely connected to both to Jupiter and Venus there. Let's see, there's a lot more that we could say here, but I just think that that sort of configuration and those relationships between Saturn, Jupiter, and Venus there, and the way that we see both, the ability to grow projects long term, to be really successful in things. If we look at houses from the sun, Jupiter is so if we count Pisces as the first house, Jupiter is there in the fifth house, the house of both artistic creation and creativity more generally, as well as the house of of pleasure. And Jupiter can certainly be associated with indulgence, and Venus as well. And that sort of hedonistic lifestyle was certainly an important part of Christopherson's own personal life, as well as themes that show up in Coil. We see Jupiter ruling the 10th house here. That would be like Sagittarius, again emphasizing the sort of success in his career and work. All right, let's just keep moving on though. We don't want to spend too much time here. So the other core member of Coil, John Balance, who was born in 1962 and died in an accident in 2004. He has a very striking birth chart. We see this really large, what's called a stellium, a large grouping of planets in Aquarius there. So we see Saturn, Mercury, Mars, the South Node, Jupiter, and the Sun, all in Aquarius. We see Venus is at 2 degrees Pisces, so he has an exalted Venus, certainly speaking to his deeply artistic and sensitive nature. Also Venus in Cancer, again emphasizing that same sensitive nature of his. Let's see, we also have Neptune in Scorpio, making a square to all those planets in Aquarius. So having so many planets in Aquarius and having Saturn and Mars together in the same sign with a number of those with a number of other planets certainly speaks to difficulties and challenges. Saturn is one of the more difficult planets, and when Saturn and Mars are together, that can often be very, very difficult situations. And Balance certainly struggled throughout his life with mental illness, with long periods of depression, and emphasized by that square from Neptune and Scorpio, also with severe alcoholism and addiction, and which ultimately contributed to his death in a drunken accident. Also opposing Aquarius, we see Uranus in Leo there. So emphasizing some of that, kind of disruptive, unstable sort of energy. Aquarius can also really be associated with an outsider status, where Capricorn can be about being inside of structures, Aquarius can be about being outside of structures, and I think Balance is absolutely someone who never felt at home, in his culture, always felt very, very much like an outsider, and I think that's something that Coil really spoke to. And I think people who are interested in Coil, or people for whom Coil meant a lot, I think finding other outside voices and expressions of outside production, outside perspectives, is certainly an important part of what they do. So although he was able to turn it into some incredible works of music and art, it is also very clearly a very difficult chart. Also, very strikingly, if we look at, this is what's called a prenatal syzygy, which is the lunation, either the full moon or the new moon that directly precedes someone's birth. So it'll be within 2 weeks prior to someone's birth. We can see we actually have all 7 classical planets here at the time of this new moon. Before he was born, we have all 7 classical planets in Aquarius, which is an extremely rare thing to happen, to get all 7 of these planets all in the same sign. So we see, Venus was still in Aquarius here, and obviously this is a new moon, so the moon is conjunct the sun. But also because the south node is here, this also tells us that this is an eclipse. So his prenatal lunation, or prenatal syzygy here, is also an eclipse. And as we'll talk about, the black sun was a very important image for Coil. And now I don't know that Balance ever actually knew that this was the case. This solar eclipse would not have been visible in England. So it's not obvious that like his parents would have been aware of this. But I just think it's a really striking thing that he's born sort of immediately after this eclipse and has this incredibly strong sort of Aquarian signature, when we absolutely see these these sort of themes, and that black sun image, which could certainly be associated with eclipses, is an important symbol and kind of logo in Coil's work. All right, so let's just keep moving on here. Before we talk specifically about Coil, I just wanted to give a little bit of the background, sort of backstory of the scene that Coil came out of, and some of the projects that preceded Coil. Let's see. So in the late 60s and early 70s, Genesis Peorage, who we can see there in the photograph, founded a musical collective and performance art group known as Coom Transmissions, working with a variety of different collaborators, including Cozy Fanny Tutti, who we also see in the photograph there. And together, the two of them did a number of performances and made other sort of art objects, often dealing with sexuality and a number of other taboo topics in a sometimes fairly confrontational manner. That was also rather scandalous. They got a lot of sort of bad reactions in the British press. They were labeled the wreckers of civilization. But this, I think, kind of confrontational relationship, with the mainstream and with the culture of their time is certainly an important part of understanding their work and what they were doing, and the desire to look at the dark sort of underbelly of the culture at that time, and I think also just reflecting some of the darker and more difficult aspects of the 1970s in England. So they worked together for several years before meeting Peter Christopherson, who joined Coombe Transmissions and did performances with them. The sort of Coombe project really culminated in, was it 1976, with a show called Prostitution at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London that featured, works of art, some documentation from their performances, as well as images that from Cozy's like pornographic modeling that she did, and incorporating those magazine images into her own works as well. This show in particular generated a lot of very negative attention from the British press, and when they were labeled the Wreckers of Civilization by a Tory MP. Around this time also, they became really disillusioned with the art world and working within art galleries in an art world context, and decided to move into to create a musical group and to try to speak to a younger audience, an audience without the kind of elite like art school background, and an audience that would, they hoped would be more receptive to what they were trying to do and say. Around this time, they also met Chris Carter, who is a musician and something of an electronics expert who was building his own sort of synthesizers and equipment. And the four of them together became the musical group Throbbing Gristle, who were drawing, both on kind of underground popular music, if you like the Velvet Underground, Kraftwerk, and some other things coming out of like early 70s in Germany were certainly a huge influence, as well as ideas from people like sort of Andy Warhol and The Factory. Also musical ideas from John Cage, musique concrète, and reaching back even further to like surrealism and Dada, and the sort of attitudes and ideas associated with a lot of those other more confrontational, intense, taboo breaking areas of of avant-garde and underground 20th century art and music. So Throbbing Gristle were really important and seminal musical group. Again, they was founded in 1976 and went until the early 1980s. They really, along with, I guess, Cabaret Voltaire, were really the kind of pioneers of what became known as industrial music, and their own record label, Industrial Records, basically coined that term, and I think set a lot of the precedents for what became industrial music and industrial culture. Let's see. After Throbbing Gristle broke up, Chris and Cozy went on to record together. They are and remain a married couple and continue to record. For a long time, they recorded as Chris and Cozy, later as Carter Tootie. Christopherson and Genesis went on to form a group, Psychic TV. And they also began a magical order known as the Temple of Psychic Youth. Let's see, Christopherson remained with Psychic TV for, I believe it was the first 2 albums, and also helped to write some of the early documents for the Temple of Psychic Youth, which was a magical order, drawing on a lot of the kind of same themes and ideas that were around in other, like chaos magic, works and movements and organizations of the late 70s and early 80s in England. And chaos magic is certainly something that we can talk about more in future videos. John Balance, who was somewhat younger than Christopherson, in his sort of late teen years, he had become a huge sort of devotee kind of fan of Throbbing Gristle. Eventually began attending like live performances and met Christopherson and began a romantic relationship with him. And they would remain together as a couple until just a couple years before Balance's death in 2004. Balance also participated in some of those early Psychic TV recordings, but eventually Balance and Christopherson, as well as some other early members associated with Psychic TV and Temple of Psychic Youth, began to feel both that they weren't being given credit for their work, that Genesis was really taking credit for things that other people were doing, that he was being they were being very controlling. and also that the Temple of Psychic Youth was increasingly turning into a cult, and that Genesis was setting themselves up as a kind of cult leader or guru figure, which the others did not want to participate in. And this led them to leaving Psychic TV, breaking contact with the temple, and beginning the project Coil in 1983. All right, so again, there's so much that could be said about Throbbing Gristle and Temple of Psychic Youth, and I'm sure there'll be opportunities to come back and talk about their sort of significance for culture in future videos. For now, just a couple of suggested readings if you'd like to sort of go a little more into their sort of history and significance. Kind of classic study on Throbbing Gristle is Simon Ford's book Records of Civilization. I think also an important kind of corrective to the sometimes unreliable accounts given by Genesis, who's tended to kind of dominate the kind of reception and perception of Coombe and Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV, is Cozy Fanny Tootie's autobiography, Art, Sex, Music, that she published a few years back, that I think is a very necessary sort of corrective to Genesis's story. And she also documents sort of Genesis's abusive behavior in that book, as well as talking about her own work, both with Throbbing Gristle and later. So that's definitely recommended. And then finally, perhaps a maybe not as well-known book is Caspar Opstrup's book, The Way Out, Invisible Insurrections and Radical Imaginaries in the UK Underground, 1961 to 1991, which talks about not just Temple of Psychic Youth, but also a number of other kind of radical underground countercultural organizations from like Alexander Trocchi's Sigma Project, the anti-university kind of associated with like the anti-psychiatry movement, the William Burroughs idea for the Academy 23, as well as some other kind of associated like countercultural movements and things like that at that time. I think it's a really interesting book and really gives a lot of interesting sort of context and background for a lot of these themes, and there's a lot of cultural references there. So that's definitely recommended. It's published by Minor Compositions, who have an open access policy, so you can easily find like a PDF of the book at no charge online. All right, so we've already touched on a few of these things here, but just a few kind of ideas and reference points in these precursors to Coil that we've been talking about here, that Coil will pick up on and continue to develop in a lot of ways. Of course, a lot of other groups that came out of the early industrial scene did this as well, but I think that Coil is, in my mind anyways, the really like kind of standout group that came out of this scene and that developed these themes in a deeper and I think more powerful way than any of the others. And that is one of the reasons I really wanted to focus on them in this video and so early in the Occulture series. William Burroughs who's someone, and Brian Geisen, we'll talk about in a future video in a few weeks. Burroughs' ideas and worldview and the themes and things like that he addresses in his writings were certainly a huge influence. Also, Burroughs' and Geisen's like tape experiments, their experience with cutting up, both the cut-up method more generally, but especially the cut-up method as applied to tapes and to film, was a really huge influence on Throbbing Gristle and on Peter Christopherson in particular. With Throbbing Gristle, Christopherson was working with using like pre-recorded like tape loops and being able to cut them together and to loop them in various ways. So really extending Burroughs' ideas into musical compositions. On the more Burroughs, as again we'll talk about, and Geisen were also magicians in their own right, and their esoteric and magical ideas were certainly an influence, both on Throbbing Gristle, and then I think even more so on Coil, who really tried to develop and extend their magical working methods, and again the connection between magic and art, and what like Burroughs, for example, really saw as the divinatory significance of the cut-up method. So not merely as a way of producing art or extending like avant-garde techniques into the writing of novels, but actually having a magical significance of being able to reveal truth through their kind of aleatory construction methods. Other esoteric influences include Aleister Crowley, who we've mentioned before in this series, and we'll certainly talk about again in future videos. Also the artist Osman Spare, who we will also talk about in future videos, and again chaos magic. These are all, I think, major touchstones for Coil, and are both influences, and whose ideas I think Coil really developed and took into new places in a very powerful way. Let's see. Also, just some general sort of ideas that Throbbing Gristle were working with and psychic TV that Coil picked up and continued to develop, including an interest in extreme states, whether physical, mental, sort of chemically induced, or even more sort of spiritual or magical states. Throbbing Gristle often explored the use of like extreme sound, high volumes or low or unusual frequencies, and the effects that those things could have on perception or on the body. As mentioned, Throbbing Gristle often explored dark or like taboo themes and images, especially associated with sort of taboo like sexuality or fetishistic sexuality, and that's certainly something that continued in Coil. Especially those things connected to some of Aleister Crowley's ideas about sexual magic and sexual ritual, certainly very important for Coil. Sort of their somewhat hostile stance towards the culture of their time, working as outsiders. I think one thing that I don't want to spend too much time on it here, but is worth thinking about in terms of industrial culture is the individualism that is often expressed, and the way that, although that was somewhat opposed to like the sort of dominant culture and politics of the late 70s in Britain, there is also a strange kind of it makes them strangely similar to Margaret Thatcher and the sort of neoliberal capitalism of the 1980s, which I think is something that is worth sort of thinking about in the ways that sometimes some of these movements or some of the groups associated with them were not always as different or as opposed to the societies that they were relating to as they may have thought themselves to be. And that's certainly that theme of individualism in a culture is certainly something that we can come back to and talk about again in future videos. At various times, sort of psychic TV and Genesis Peerage spoke about concepts of like esotericism or cultural engineering or occultural engineering, though not always in an extremely clear way. But there was some idea of relating to and processing like cultural material, but also trying to intervene into culture in various ways. Something that you see in some of these works that again Coil also picked up was a close connection between like artistic production and research. So there's a lot of the idea that research is a part of art making, and that the way that art or art artifacts or like records could function is as distribution of information, or as as points of contact for kind of alternative information or information that may be more difficult to access or come by. Obviously this is especially true in the pre-internet days, when finding information on various sources, especially more threatening or kind of underground types of ideas, could be quite difficult. But they, I think, functioned as important connection points for members of those developing countercultures. All right, so moving on and into Coil's own work here. I have a quote here from an interview with John Balance, where he says he's talking about the role of magic in his life and in the music of Coil. And he said that, magic imposed itself on me when I was 11 years old and caused me a lot of problems. It's another way of looking at the world. Coincidences are not coincidences. Accidents are not accidents. One can control and influence one's existence thanks to magic. We practice it every day in our lives. There are rituals, sexual in general, where I exercise my will towards a precise object or image. With Coil, we project this magic into our work. We practice music with supernatural powers in a deliberate way. It awakens the senses and changes the perception of reality, just like a drug. So, I think we can obviously hear a little bit of that, his sort of Aquarian nature here, the fact that he was just born as an outsider, that he was born looking at the world from a very different perspective than those around him, and from what was, acceptable by the society of his time. Balance talks in other interviews about really being born with a kind of pagan or magical sensibility. From the time he was quite young. He was also, and again, in addition to being a sort of pagan and practicing magician, he was also very interested in astral travel, in psychedelic exploration, and psychedelics and the use of drugs is certainly a huge kind of touchstone in Coil's work, and those experiences were hugely influential on them, both for good and ill, as we'll talk about. Let's see. So as we already said, Throbbing Gristle and Temple of Psychic Youth had brought together like occult ideas from William Burroughs, Brian Geisen, Crowley, Osman Spare, and had some mutual influence with the developing chaos magic movement. And sexual magic was also quite important for Temple of Psychic Youth, developing some ideas both from Aleister Crowley as well as from Osman Spare. Balance is also, perhaps more so than I think really any of the other people that we've mentioned here, was really influenced by surrealism, and even sometimes described the Coil as a kind of neo-surrealist project. And again, surrealism is something that we will come back to in just a couple weeks, actually, in this series, because it's certainly an important part of my thinking about occulture and modern esotericism. So I think it's quite interesting to consider Coil as a surrealist musical project. All right, and then finally here, just a couple thoughts on the place of, or the relationship between magic and music within Coil. On the simplest level, we can simply find esoteric references or images in lyrics and album artwork, in their music videos, in the sort of stage and costume design. We also get the idea of music as ritual. This could certainly be implied in the live shows, like music as a kind of collective ritual between the band and the audience, or the sort of stage performance itself as ritualized, which is something we'll talk more about as we go along here. Also, the use of magical methodologies for the actual creation of the works, or thinking about the creation of music and art as a sort of alchemical process, especially related to sampling, the taking of sounds either from other works of music or non-musical sources, or even sounds that they themselves are recording in the studios, and processing them and transforming them, often through like repeated stages of transformation, to turn them into something that was only there in potential within the original sound source, and that may be totally unexpected or unintended by themselves or by any of those creators. And so using that kind of alchemical sound processing to produce like marvelous works or new or unexpected things. I think they certainly thought of that as in a magical or esoteric fashion, and also. As we already mentioned earlier about the works of art or music being able to directly influence consciousness or transform consciousness. This is something, especially in some of Coil's later works, that absolutely become important, that simply listening to the music would induce, kind of an altered state that had a magical intention, an intention to transform the listeners and to open themselves up to new part of themselves or to new parts of the world that they might not otherwise have seen. And there being a magical intent there, absolutely. All right, so in 1983, basically as Coil is forming, John Balance wrote a manifesto, and I just wanted to read, not the whole thing, you can look it up, it's quite easy to find online, although there are a few different versions with some variations in the text, but just a few excerpts from that manifesto to help get us thinking about some themes and images that we'll talk about it when we get into their specific works. So let's see, he writes, Coil is a hidden universal, a code, a key for which the whole does not exist, is non-existent, in silence and in secrecy. A spell, a spiral, a serpent's eshed around a female cycle, a whirlwind, a double helix, DNA, electricity and elementals, atonal noise and brutal poetry. So yeah, we see them start to set out sort of themes that they'll work with here, atonal noise and brutal poetry, some of the vision of what Coil could be, electricity and elementals, that combination of modern technology with these very ancient, forms of magic and a kind of pagan sensibility. Also playing on the different meanings of the word coil itself, like an electrical coil is certainly there. Also the double helix of DNA, as a coil, a whirlwind, serpents, cycles, spirals, right? All just playing on possible meanings of the word coil. Let's see, in the next paragraph, coil is amorphous, luminous and in constant change, inbuilt obsolescence, inbuilt disobedience, a vehicle for obsessions, dream cycles and perpetual emotion. This idea of constant change, I think, is an interesting part of Coil for sure, more than almost any other musical group I could think of. They transformed themselves and reimagined themselves, and so that I think that magical, like transformative intention in their work is also there in their own identity as a musical project, constantly sort of rethinking or in reimagining their own project and the nature of what it is that they're doing. So really like internalizing some of those themes and applying it to the project itself. Let's see, a vehicle for obsessions, dream cycles, and perpetual motion. Certainly touching on some surrealist themes in the exploration of and expression of the unconscious, and and in dream states, which are certainly an important reference point for Coil and for the surrealists, obviously, but for magic more generally as well. Let's see, continuing on here, Coil are archangels of chaos. The price we pay for existence is eternal warfare. Dreams lead us under the surface, over the edge, to the delirium state, unchained. So again, we see themes of dreams and delirium, altered states, and those surrealist elements. Also combinations of incompatible or seemingly incompatible or contradictory things, which has an absolutely alchemical as well as surrealist resonance for sure. Archangels of chaos. That second line there in that paragraph, the price we pay for existence is eternal warfare, is a slight paraphrase of a quote from Aleister Crowley from, chapter 80 of the Book of Lies. Let's see, moving on here, Kabbalah and chaos. And again, here we see more of these sort of combinations of contradictory elements. Kabbalah and chaos, Thanatos and Thelema, archangels and antichrists, open and close, truth and deliberation, traps and disorientation. Coil exists between here and here. We are Janus-headed, plural, out of time, out of place, out of spite. All right, so let's, so basically for the rest of this video, we will look at just sort of chronologically go through Coil's works. This will not be complete. Coil have an incredibly vast discography, all kinds of singles and EPs and compilations and other sort of things. So this will not be a complete tour through their recordings. I'm selecting here things that are especially relevant, that have especially clear like esoteric themes, and that I thought were important to talk about in this exploration of the esoteric themes in their work. All right, so this is their first recording, other than some early kind of tape stuff and some things like that. This is their first EP, How to Destroy Angels. Although it is classed as an EP, it was released on a 12-inch. Though it's only the A side is actually cut. The side How to Destroy, the track long composition, so How to Destroy Angels. And then the B-side is not just silent, but actually like has no groove at all, which they've titled Absolute Elsewhere. So on the cover there, you can see they have a text, liner notes here, and we can just read an excerpt from this here. So let's see. It says, throughout history, man has made and used music for two distinct and separate purposes. In recent years, particularly since the advent of sound recording, the most popular use of music has been for entertainment, the temporary amusement and distraction of as large a number as possible. As a consequence, many people tend to overlook its more fundamental and ancient use as a tool for affecting man's body and spirit. So, I think just emphasizing some of the things that we've already said about this intention to make, serious magical ritual music, with a serious and transformative intent. Here in this particular recording is a music, let's see, it says ritual music for the accumulation of male sexual energy. So, again, tapping to sex magic, to ritual, obviously, and, the intent to transform that those listeners who listen to the album, will have this sort of energetic process or will participate in this energetic process. And they do it specifically here through is an invocation of the planet Mars, which can be, which is often associated with male sexuality and that sort of energy. They also associate it with spring and with renewal. And so there's a kind of combination here of like destruction and renewal. Another sort of bringing together of sort of contradictory elements here. And in creating the album, they tried to use both materials and various sort of like rhythms and numerological elements that correspond to the planet Mars, a lot of them drawn from Aleister Crowley's Book of Correspondences, 777, which we can definitely talk about in a future video, as well as some other objects like bull roars, that are associated with like male rites of passage. And so really trying both the materials that they're making the work with, as well as the sort of patterns of the work itself are being specifically designed with magical correspondences to produce the desired effect, which is, I think, in Aleister Crowley's theory of ritual, of trying to arrange all the different elements of a ritual and the different sort of sensory impressions to produce a certain desired end. Even the fact that the record label is red and or the album cover, I mean to say, is the color it is. That it's red and fiery is like a martial color. So even at the level of the album art, everything is focused on this ritual intention. All right, so later the same year, they released their first full length, their first album, and this is Scatology. So two different album covers we see there. The one on the left is the cover from at least some versions of the vinyl, and then on the right we see a later CD reissue. On both, we see this. This is the black sun glyph that we've already mentioned. The black sun there. This particular image is actually drawn from one of the so-called holy books of Thelema that was received by Aleister Crowley. This is from a text called Liber Arcanorum, where Crowley received these different kind of sigils or magical images associated with different powers. But Coil have taken the image and sort of recontextualized it and used it quite differently here. So again, one way of reading it is as a black sun. I think there's also a certain similarity between this image and the 8-pointed chaos star that they also used in some of their works and was really prominent in that kind of chaos magic scene at the time. Interestingly, that chaos star that is one of the, or probably the main image of chaos magic, was actually drawn from some of Michael Moorcock's works. I think some of the Eternal Champion stuff with the forces of chaos sort of use that image. Another interesting example of things passing from from popular works of fiction into serious esoteric usage. Let's see. So the black sun is an extremely complicated image. We could definitely spend quite a bit of time talking about it, but maybe just a few notes about it here. In some interviews, Balance talks about it as a surrealist emblem, which I can think of maybe a couple works where a black sun actually appears, like in surrealist paintings. I'm not sure what the main reference for Balance would have been there. Certainly there is a kind of surrealist resonance in the idea of a black sun, because it is such a contradictory thing, right? The sun is the brightest thing, that there is in our daily lives. And so the idea of the sun becoming black, there's an immediate sort of contradiction there that absolutely makes it surrealist. As we connected with Balance's birth chart already, we could certainly think of this, as related to eclipse, and some of the associations and the sort of danger and the striking nature of eclipses is the fact that something that is normally very, very bright and shining suddenly becomes dark. So there's that kind of unexpected sort of transformation of something into its opposite there. Alchemically, the black sun can be associated with the process of nigredo, or the black work, which is the work of putrefaction and breaking down forms before they are then purified and further transformed in the alchemical process. In the context of scatology and some of Coil's other work, I think we can certainly read this image here as an image of the anus, relating to both the themes of this album, the scatological themes of this album, as well as to like gay sexuality more generally, and like homosexual sex magic, that is certainly such an important element in Coil's work. Let's see. So on the album cover there, we see the male buttocks there, like framed in an upside down cross. This is basically a slight variation of a photograph by Man Ray, who's an important surrealist photographer, who had done very similar photograph, except his is a photograph of a woman. So this is a kind of like gay updating, I guess, of that Man Ray photo, which is quite interesting. Let's see, just a few notes about some of the sort of tracks and the specific content of scatology. I think in line with a few of the things we've just said about alchemy and transformation, one of the main ideas that they spoke about it in connection with scatology was the alchemical work of turning shit into gold. Which is a sort of variation that you'll see in other alchemical works too, of turning lead into gold, of turning something that is, waste and refuse, something that is rejected, something that is an object of disgust or horror, and that being transformed into, or alternatively seen as, an object of renewal and joy and of life. Again, that alchemical intention. Of descending into the darkness in order to transform it into something else, which I think is something that sets Coil apart from a lot of other industrial or more like extreme kind of noise or other groups that they are sometimes associated with, that there's never an indulgence in either darkness or in unpleasant or troubling or disturbing themes or sounds simply for their own sake, but always an intention to understand those things, to incorporate them, to transform them, and to set them within a kind of like life affirming and world affirming, body affirming sort of context, which I think makes them very powerful, that they're willing to look at these things, but never but there's always that. What, for lack of a better term, we call it the sort of positive and again, life-affirming intention behind it. Let's see. So in the album, again, as we mentioned, there's quite a bit of sampling here, which they're often doing with a Fairlight, which is an early piece of equipment that was often not used by underground bands, but was being used by Peter Gabriel or Kate Bush. Kate Bush was a big sort of influence on Coil, and we mentioned her briefly in the last video, the first video in this series. Again, a lot of use of sampling here, and the transforming of things through the use of transforming of samples and the transforming of materials. both from other musical works as well as like recordings of non-musical sources. We see themes here of kind of extreme states, like the song Panic is about fear and about the use of fear or these kind of extreme states of delirium, disorientation, but understanding them as a magical sort of process of inducing an altered state of consciousness, or even seeing them as a kind of sacred state, or a state where either the unconscious or sort of transpersonal materials are able to come through, or whether there is able to be intervention into the self and transformation of the self or the personal psychology. Let's see. So again, themes of we see themes of death, like disease. The song "Clap." There's both the clapping, especially in a musical context, as well as the sexually transmitted disease. The song "Solar Lodge" includes a number of references to the black sun, as well as the magical organization, the Solar Lodge, which you can sort of look into if you're interested there. I don't want to spend the time to talk about it there. Sewage Workers' Birthday Party is probably the most explicitly scatological work here, which as the liner notes explain, was drawn from a kind of gay fetish sort of magazine that they're working with there, as well as a number of home recordings of sexual activities that are being sort of processed and transformed into music there. All right, let's just keep moving on here. All right, so this is their second full-length album, Horse Rotivator, from a few years later. Continuing on with some of the same themes that we see in scatology, though I think really shifting the focus here from sort of rejected materials here to a focus on death, which already came up in the previous album, but becomes more of the focus here. I think certainly the background of the AIDS epidemic is a really important context for understanding this album. As gay men who were involved in the gay scene in London at the time, this was an enormous impact on their lives and their lifestyle, and seeing people they knew become ill and begin to die was obviously an extremely difficult and troubling thing. But in line with their general philosophy and approach of taking these very difficult, threatening, sort of dark materials and transforming them into music and into art. The title "Horse Rotivator" refers to a dream that Balance said that he had involving the four horsemen of the apocalypse, sort of slaying their horses, and then I think it was transforming their jawbones into some sort of earth-moving device. So we see sort of death connected with almost a kind of agricultural image, that sort of fertilizes the soil and turns up the earth. There's certainly an apocalyptic, resonance here, which is something we see throughout sort of Coil's works, is that kind of interest in a kind of apocalyptic sort of themes and imagery. And even on the previous album, we can maybe hear a kind of verbal link between scatology and eschatology, right? Eschatology being the study of the end times. Eschaton was a word they would later use for one of their record labels. Let's see. So just a few notes on some of the tracks here on this album. The Anal Staircase, continuing some of the sort of gay themes from the previous album, as well as a kind of initiatory sort of sense of this traveling downwards into areas of experience and away from the dominant culture and what's normally accepted as quote unquote normal, like human sexuality or experience. But also into a world that can be so dark and threatening at the same time. Let's see. Circles of Mania and Blood from the Air, tracks continuing to be interested in aberrant mental states, as we already talked about there. This track, Who by Fire, is a cover of the Leonard Cohen song, which sort of enumerates different forms of death there. Let's see, two of these tracks, The Golden Section and Ostia, we can take a look at some of the lyrics to those in more detail. And then finally, the album ends with an instrumental track called The First 5 Minutes After Death. As we talked about, moving through and beyond, the sort of themes of death and dissolution and putrefaction into something beyond. And yeah, I think that's a kind of a powerful way of sort of finishing this album, of looking at, the experience of someone in the after-death state. All right, so so here are some of the lyrics. I've kind of shortened some of the redundancies and repetitions here. So this is a track called Ostia, The Death of Pasolini. Pasolini this is Pier Paolo Pasolini, the Italian filmmaker. He was also a poet, sort of Marxist activist as well, who was quite important. Some of his films were quite important to Coil. I think maybe especially his film Salo, which is based on the Marquis de Sade's 120 Days of Sodom, though updated to the Italy during the time of World War II, and connecting it with sort of the fascism of that time. Let's see. So this is, at least in part, about Pasolini's death. Pasolini was murdered, possibly by a rent boy, possibly by various forms of various enemies that he may have had. I think his murder has never been conclusively sort of resolved. But that, I think, sort of connection of sex and death is certainly an important theme in the album that they're obviously interested in here. Let's see. I just wanted to talk about some of the lyrics. I think this is also just a really nice example of Balance's his lyrics and the really kind of like complex, multi-layered, but also very like ambiguous, his use of images that I think is quite powerful and I think has a real sort of surrealist sort of dimension. So let's see. We'll just read through them here. There's honey in the hollows, in the contours of the body, a sluggish golden river, a sickly golden trickle. Starting off with some kind of erotic images, we already have images of honey here, and we'll see the gold, being associated with the sun, and we'll see a number of other like solar images here as well. But then in the next line we have, you can hear the bones humming. So we have an interesting substitution already where, the humming associated with honey, would normally be bees, but we here have a sort of a substitution of bees for bones. I think there's also a verbal connection between bones and Ostia. Ostia, the name of the place in Italy where Pasolini was murdered. And although it's not etymologically linked to like osteo, like meaning bone, I think we certainly, that you can still hear it as a kind of a verbal connection. And then now getting into some of the details of Pasolini's own murder, Pasolini was run over repeatedly by a car. So we get the car reverses over the body in the basin, in the shallow seaplane basin. And the car reverses over and his body rolls over, crushed from the shoulder, right? So now getting some of these images of death and the destruction of the body, where, in the first verse that we quoted there, the hollows and the contours of the body are filled with, honey and are a place of, like eroticism and delight. We now have, the body in its fragility and in its destruction and death. You can hear the bones humming, singing like a puncture. So again, sort of connecting up some of these images we've already been talking about here. The next line that I've quoted here I think is quite interesting. Killed to keep the world turning. Almost seeing Pasolini's murder and perhaps the deaths of those around them. At this time, almost in a sort of sacred atmosphere, as if they are. Some sort of sacrifice, necessary for keeping the world turning. And now we have an interesting kind of short-circuiting between Pasolini's murder and something much closer to home. We get throw his bones over the white cliffs of Dover. The White Cliffs of Dover were, I think, famous as a popular suicide spot. People would jump off of the cliffs as a suicide method in England here. So now we get, kind of short-circuiting between Pasolini's death and, a spot associated with death closer to home. And into the Sea of Rome, and the bloodstained coast of Ostia. So even the geography is being kind of collaged together here between their own local geography in England and the geography in Italy where Pasolini died. All right, and now returning to some of these solar themes, we get Leon like a lion sleeping in the sunshine, right? So the lions are associated with the sun, with the color gold, and the honey again here as well. And then this next line, out of the strong came forth sweetness. This is a reference to the biblical story of Samson and the riddle that he tells, where he had seen the bees making a hive inside the rotting corpse of a lion. And out of the strong, something sweet is part of the riddle that he tells here. So, bringing together this images of death, of the sun, of decay, but then also of honey. So this bringing together of contradictory and incompatible images. But again, obviously with this magical sort of sensitivity to the solar correspondences and themes here. All right, and then just last few lines here. And the car reverses over the white cliffs. And so now we have the car reversing over the white cliffs of Dover. So again, this sort of overlapping of time and space here, where the car, that ran over Pasolini is now driving off of the cliff in England. And Murder Me in Ostia. So even a kind of identification, with Pasolini and with his murder here and death. There's a lot here. We certainly only kind of scratched the surface even here, but hopefully that's a nice sort of example of, example of the Balance's own sort of lyrical and writing style, and I think the really sort of complex and surrealist way that he's working with words and images and playing on sort of sounds and thinking about their magical connections and correspondences. All right, and then just a brief excerpt from what's the second to last track on the album called The Golden Section, where they used a text taken from Peter Lamborn Wilson's book, Angels. And Peter Lamborn Wilson is someone we will talk about later in this series. I think an important thing to realize about Coil is that they're always, again, I think connected to some of these ideas of research and the connection between research and artistic production that we've already mentioned. They're always drawing on a variety of sources, and I think an important way into understanding Coil's music is to understand the reference points that they're drawing on. And just like the music involves like sampling of other sound sources and other musical sources, a lot of the lyrics are sort of sampled or appropriated, sometimes transformed, sometimes not, from other sources. But I think also always with a sensitivity to how that process draws a link between the music that they're creating and various cultural products or thinkers or other artists that have come before them. And I think that makes Coil certainly for me, beginning to listen to Coil when I was younger, they became a really important nodal point for, not just for exploring esotericism and its themes, but also all kinds of other artistic and philosophical and cultural works by exploring various, references. They, function for me anyways as a really important, sort of node in exploring a whole kind of a cultural universe. All right, so just a brief excerpt from this track. In fact, a strange connection becomes apparent between mors and amor, love and death. The moment of extinction and the pleasure of love resembles that of death, and thus that of the mystic. In mythic terms, Eros and Thanatos are almost twins. Both love and death are gateways, hence their eternal adolescence and their fixation in the midst of the rites of passage. So again, touching on some of the themes we've already mentioned of the connection between sex and death, and especially the resonances of those things during the AIDS crisis at this time. But also with their broader themes of altered states, with extreme states, and with sort of pushing beyond all of the ordinary limits of the human and human consciousness and human experience. There's that that sense, like that concept of a limit experience, of both love and death, being sort of ways out or ways into something beyond, and that even being a kind of mystical experience of transcending ordinary human limitations and boundaries. So yeah, that's all we'll say about Horse Rotivator. Certainly a great album, definitely one of their most important. I know some people consider it to be their best album. I certainly think it's the best album of the 90s, or I'm sorry, of the 80s, or at least into the early 90s. But there's some later materials that I prefer, but certainly one of their most important and significant works. Oops. All right, so I'm not going to say too much about the individual tracks here, but I just wanted to mention this is another album from the 80s here called Gold is the Metal with the Broadest Shoulders. This is a release of some kind of outtakes and unused materials and some demos and things like that from both Scatology and Horse Rotivator. And the title of this album, is drawn from an alchemical text, and I think the interesting thing here is that they're working with their own materials in this alchemical kind of fashion. They're taking literally the kind of like refuse and cast off, almost like the excrement of the recording process, and then transforming that into new material. And again, just emphasizing the way that they're really thinking about every level of production as part of the process and as relevant. So even approaching their own, not recording and releasing of music and thinking about that as an alchemical process, I think is really interesting. This video is going on for quite a while, so I think we will split this up into two parts. So let's see, let's take a break here, and I will be back in the next few days with the second part of this video. See you in a few days. All right, thanks everybody. Take care.